Welcome to another segment of the Grace Reigns Christian Bible course. Today we're going to talk about a book that I acquired when I inherited a wonderful Christian library from two dear friends of mine, Terry Kester and Barbara Kester, husband and wife. This library was Barbara's mother's. She, throughout her many years, all through the 20th century, had acquired many books, including some secular books that have value in showing us how some ideologies can be overcome by those who may have been indoctrinated into them. Now, this particular study does not target any particular ideology, but does address the issues involved in many ideologies that people get caught up in, especially when they do not have all the facts and do not have an understanding of what the truth is. And of course, we as Christians know that the truth is found in the Bible, that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. The book that I'm talking about that came from Charlotte L. Culbertson's library is the book entitled Brainwashing. This particular book has many things in it that rang familiar to me as I studied it. We're going to go through this, and I pray that the Lord will be with all of us, that we'll be able to discern truth, that we'll be able to see deceit clearly in our lives. And I'll just begin by telling you some about the author. The entire title is Brainwashing: The True and Terrible Story of the Man Who Endured and Defied the Most Diabolical Red Torture. The author's name is Edward Hunter. The book says, "This war book you will never forget, a fascinating document." That came from the Chicago Tribune. This book was published in 1958. Now, Edward Hunter was a correspondent in 1927, a reporter, a news editor of the Tokyo Advisor, and editor of the Hankow Herald and the Peiping Leader. He has watched the development of psychological warfare from the invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese to the conquest of Ethiopia by the Italians and the Spanish Civil War. From Pearl Harbor to VJ Day, he served with the U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater. He spent some years in this country and in far parts of the world, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and elsewhere, collecting material for this particular book. This is the story of the men who defied the brainwashing that they were put under. One of the statements in this book says, "It is practically impossible to fight something until it has been given a name." It took a while for the world to understand what the men who had been caught by the North Korean government and placed in prison camps, and the mental tortures that they did endure, and physical tortures as well. Now, I don't know what goes on today, and I'm not addressing those issues. However, I do see many deceits where men who are captured and then basically either brainwashed into stating that they were guilty of something and speaking out against their own government that they came from. That's clear today. There are people who we see on our television set who are being videotaped, and it is used as a propaganda for the offensive country. And I'll just say that and leave it at that. The German-born sinologue Max Perlberg, who is fluent in both modern and classical Chinese, told the author that the term might well have been derived from the Buddhist expression heart-washing, which goes back to the time of Mencius. Heart-washing referred to the withdrawal into meditation of a middle-aged man, perhaps weary of worldly cares. That's just a description of what brainwashing might appear to be. After the exchange of prisoners of war in Korea, I was asked a number of times by repatriates, now sadder and wiser, and this was what they asked. And of course, this is the author of this book speaking. And the soldiers would all have the same question: why wasn't I told? Why didn't I know that this was going on? If I had only been told. I don't believe it could have happened to me, they said. Colonel Frank H. Schwabel, who confessed participation in a non-existent germ warfare, and Corporal Claude Batchelor, the impressionable lad who declared he didn't want to come home and then changed his mind. I saw white men coming out of China across the plank railway bridge at the border of Hong Kong's leased territory, or through the medieval archway at the Portuguese colony of Macau. I remember one in particular because he seemed to symbolize them all. He walked across the boards feebly, his eyes staring ahead with frightful intensity. He looked centuries older than his middle age. He kept on walking until he was recognized and stopped by a fellow priest assigned to the bridge just for such meetings. His Leninist uniform, adapted by Dr. Sun Yat-sen from the Chinese and slightly altered by the Reds, gave no hint of his religious calling. He stood and stared at his colleague and barely answered. He could not grasp the fact that he was out of reach of the brainwashers. He just stood and stared for several minutes. Then suddenly realization broke through to him. This was freedom. He was in the free world. This was more than he could bear. He took a few steps to the side of the bridge and sat down. Then he burst into tears. He was a big man, no longer young, yet he wept like a little child. I do not know how long he cried this way, for I felt as if I were intruding on a man's Calvary. I turned away. Many of the tactics that were used by the North Koreans, particularly the brainwashing, was undetected, and this following page gives some of the reasons. The Reds threatened to severely punish and even kill the closest associates of any man who broke the hush-hush. Before leaving Red China, each person had to designate a hostage who would sign a guarantee for him. This enabled the communist authorities to avoid making direct threats. The nightmare vision of such old colleagues being put to the rank and tortured unto death rose before the man's eyes and gagged his throat when he wanted to speak out. Usually they were in no shape to speak coherently, even if they wanted to. They were sick in mind as much as in body. Horror spoke eloquently through their eyes, but the reporters needed specific details to quote. When a reporter detected a desire in a man to let go with his true feelings and tell what he had seen and suffered, there usually was a representative of the Home Office or some official to intervene and say, "Let the man rest," or to take him aside and warn him not to say a word, to wait until a later date, when you will be in better shape, and, quote, "after you have consulted your headquarters," unquote. The latter date, during the first year or so, never came. The hush-hush dragged on. This was not the first time that the communists had been able to keep a deadly secret from the free world as well as from the bulk of their own population. The existence of tremendous slave labor camps in the Soviet Union was kept hidden for many years in this same manner. They were begun as far back as 1920 in the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea, not far from Leningrad. A quarter of a century and World War II were to pass before these became fairly wide knowledge. Yet 10 to 20 million persons at a time were incarcerated in these forced labor camps. Untold millions of men and women perished under barbed wire enclosures. Enormous industrial enterprises of every kind were set up, from textile production to mining. When vast labor gangs were required for back-breaking work on such enormous projects as the Volga-Don Canal network linking the Caspian and the Black Seas, untold hundreds of thousands of slaves, labored of both sexes, were used like animals, regardless of the beating sun, drenching rain, or deadly cold. Vast slave establishments are a vital part of the brainwashing strategy. Communism requires them both as a softening up medium against minds and as a source of production. Normal people in the free world refused to believe that such barbarities could exist in our civilized day and age. Proof had slipped out years before to a small circle of political alert persons, but they were stymied whenever they tried to get the facts to the public. Every sort of diversionary and string-pulling tactic was brought into play to keep the operation secret. What is scarcely appreciated, even yet, is that these establishments went unknown for so long. The hush-hush methods that kept slave labor a secret were employed all over again for brainwashing. Actually, brainwashing was first put on display at the Red Purge trials of 1936. Other big show trials followed at short intervals, each providing the world with still another baffling performance in self-accusation, with insistence on personal guilt and whining appeals for punishment unto death. These persons acted as if possessed. Communist Russia was able to keep brainwashing secret by its thorough control of information, which made an isolated island out of every man and office in the Soviet Union. No individual or bureau dared to communicate with any other except through the approved channels. When the Chinese mainland fell to the communists, brainwashing began to be employed. The secret that Moscow had guarded so successfully at its front door in Europe slipped out through the back door in China. The futility and tragic consequences of secrecy had begun to draw on the free world. The free world began to bear strange reports from the communist-operated prisoner of war camps in North Korea. Broadcasts were heard in voices recognized as those of normal young men of the American, British, and other UN forces. The voices belonged to these men, but the language did not. Pro-communist publications everywhere began to carry purported confessions and grotesquely worded statements said to have been signed by these soldiers in support of whatever propaganda appeal international communism was making at the moment. He appeared to be under a weird, unnatural compulsion to go on with the whole train of thought from beginning to end, even when it had been rendered silly. For example, he spoke of no force being applied to him, even after someone already had pointed out that he had been in shackles. He was like a spider driven by its instincts to go on, weaving its web, no longer capable of using free will or adapting himself to a situation for which he had been unstructured. He had to go on as if manipulated by the instincts alone. This was the party discipline extended to the mind. A trance element was in it. Now, even intelligent people were drawn into this. The Japanese, the author says, that I met, who had returned from Siberian POW camps, singing communist songs, shouting red slogans, and raising the clenched fist salute, had similar reactions. They had been captured by the Soviet army when Moscow rushed into the war in Asia in its last few days in order to have a legal basis for political intervention and wholesale looting of the industrial plants in Manchuria. These returning Japanese fiercely snubbed their weeping, horrified loved ones who had come far distances to welcome them home. I talked to some of them about a year later, when they had recovered from their frenzy. What all these persons told me was identical in essential detail. On the other hand, I met many men who had stood up marvelously against exceedingly tough blows and who had survived honorably. They frequently seemed at a loss to explain how they had done it. Simple, down-to-earth truths had been their pillar and their strength. To be successful, brainwashing depended fundamentally on the subject's ignorance of it. When understood, the worst that the red laboratories could produce could be thwarted by the character of the free man. The patterns were irrefutable, for now there were two patterns, one for destruction of the mind and the other for its preservation. The former was sheer evil, and decent people were revolted and frightened by the thought that such things could be in this mid-20th century. But the other, less sensational pattern left me without any doubt as to what the outcome would be in this ultimate conflict for the minds of the people of the earth. That is, if the facts about brainwashing could be gotten to the people. Thanks to the communist blunder of waging a senseless, aggressive war in Korea, the knowledge of brainwashing, its vulnerabilities, as well as its strong points, can now be made known to all. And of course, this was published in 1958. So taking into consideration, we're not even 100 years past when this all took place. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov meant almost nothing to the author when he began to find out about brainwashing. Dr. Leon Freedom, an eminent Baltimore neuropsychiatrist whose personal interest had been deeply aroused by these new pressures of the mind and who was well acquainted with Pavlov's work, first drew the author's attention to the remarkable similarities between them. He began to read up on him. He says, "My main sources were his own lectures, through which I could plod only very slowly and lectures about him, which were obscured by a mixture of clinical terminology and red political verbiage clear only to the initiate. The more I delved into it, the more connection I found between the POW camps and Pavlov's experiments. The Academy's reports repeatedly insisted that Pavlov had intended his strictly objective method of investigation to be applied to man as well as to beast. This included man's speech activity, too, I read, and the functions of the first signal system and the second signal system. Did this have anything to do with the slogans? I found there was a direct relationship there, too. There is a growing appreciation of their value to the philosophy of dialectical materialism. The light had replaced the food in the mind of the dog, the way a slogan or label can replace a thought in a man's mind. The caption merely read, "Reflex caused by flashing light." Its reflex, by which it sent an order to the salivary glands in the jaw that food was on the way and to prepare to receive it by secreting saliva, had been accomplished. Finally, when only the light flashed without food, the gears went into motion anyway, and the same message was sent to the brain, to the salivary glands. An attitude had been created. A caption explained this as the pathway to the arc of the conditioned reflex. Conditioned, in Pavlov's experiments, meant induced by man or by outside influences. By unconditioned, he meant natural or instinctive. Conditioned reflex action can be brought about deliberately, and this is what the communist hierarchy now relies upon to make a basic change in human nature, to give birth to the new Soviet man, in whom the conception of the individual I is to be replaced by the we of collectivity. This was the part that made the film of such vital importance to the training laboratories operated by the Soviet secret police. Conditioned reflexes could conceivably be produced to make this youth react like the dog that rolled over at its trainer's signal. Only instead of the light, the Kremlin could use words as signals. Any words would do. Imperialism, learning, running dog of the imperialists, people friend of the people, big brother, without any relationship to their actual meaning. The Kremlin's plan was to make these reflexes instinctive. An ordinary person in the 30s who insisted that the reason the Kremlin produced this film was to teach the use of such practices on mankind would have been accused of being ridiculously obsessed by communism. But we now know well enough that the Kremlin actually was making just such plans for the future. The purge trials burst into the headlines in 1936. The brainwashing strategy by then had been developed by constant clinical experimentation. In the POW camps in Korea in the early 1950s, it was the isolated man who received the brunt of the pressure. The scene with the harnessed boy could have warned the free world that these experiments really had human beings in view. A conditioned reflex can be worked out to every stimulus, it said. Such calm laboratory language didn't sound as if it could possibly have any application to the everyday living. What it meant to the indoctrinated was plain enough. Any human activity, from the flow of saliva to an embrace, could be clinically predetermined in a politico-medical laboratories by connecting it with a shouted or written slogan, a hand signal, a smear word, or the color of a man's skin. Anything could be made into a trigger, or what the Pavlovian doctors called a stimulus. This was what the caption meant. What they had learned from animals could be used to intrude into the mind and soul of a man, to warp and change his brain. Brain changing was the culmination of this whole evil process. When actual damage was done to the man's mind through drugs, hypnotism, or other means, so that a memory of what had actually happened would be wiped out of his mind, and a new memory of what never happened inserted. By shouting it from the housetops, he made it easy for his followers to carry out his instructions, while he could rest confident that others would not see through his machinations. The few who managed to do so, he was sure, would be neutralized and hushed up by the ridicule and attack to which they would be subjected by collaborators and dupes. That is the point at which communism is bound to fail. He explained how an animal could possess in greater or lesser degree the same senses and feelings as a man up to a certain point. Beyond that, the man had something in addition that made him man. This was his reasoning faculty, his reasoned judgment, and reasoned free will. So long as reason could be kept healthy and free, man's future was safe. "There's one more question I want to ask you," I said. "Did the scenes with the boy mean that some unscrupulous power group might succeed someday in inducing a whole population to react to its wishes in the same unquestioning way a dog can be trained to obey its master?" Dr. Freedom did not reply as promptly as before. Much more grimly, he explained that insofar as a human being allowed the divine traits in him to be overcome and his reasoning power, his judgment and free will to be atrophied, he could be made into a demon, a puppet, a sick man psychologically. The full-length movies about Pavlov and his conditioned reflex experiments were merely popularized versions of the brief film, with new symbols chosen in accordance with the different types of audiences to be influenced at home and abroad. One film was a highly dramatic biography in which Pavlov's theories were presented as a scientific basis for the acceptance of brainwashing as a natural stage in man's evolution. The Soviet rewrote history for personal reasons. So we can see here that the rewriting of history and either whitewashing it or completely changing it is a tactic that is used in brainwashing. The book tells here that Pavlov never knew that his simple findings were to become the modern basis of brainwashing, and many believe he would have recoiled in horror. Nothing he ever said indicated that he entertained any such hideous concept as mind control. His purpose, as he always insisted, was to make use of animals to discover basic laws in physiology, which would help medical science heal the afflictions of the human body and work toward the avoidance of mental disorders. Many American soldiers and other soldiers from other countries were accused of germ warfare in Korea. And this is what they wanted them to confess. If they could get them to confess that, then they could film it, and then they would appear to be the victims in the war, and that Korea's concerns then would be legitimized. In brain warfare, ultimate victory lay in the conquest of attitudes and feelings. One soldier by the name of Hayes had gone through many such trivial interrogations as went on during the brainwashing techniques, and they hadn't flustered him. But the cumulative effect was achieving the Reds' purpose at last. Now I know that their aim was to becloud my clarity of mind, he said. They were chiseling away at my memory, yet I could still look back and tell them exactly what I had said or done, and was equally positive on what I hadn't. This is what is called false memories, and they produced false memories by continually interrogating them and breaking them down, and thought suggestion and just all kinds of techniques. But he said, this uninterrupted use of my memory every moment even made my mind clearer. So he held on to his mind and his clarity of mind during the times when he was going through the interrogation. There were times when the soldiers, some of them, would even, through being forced to confess to their masters, whoever these people were that were in charge, whoever it was at the time, during their incarceration there. They could actually bring about hallucinations, continually getting them to confess over and over and over again, something that actually had never happened. But it got to the point for some of them where they couldn't tell reality from unreality. And so they would confess, not actually knowing if they really had done something wrong or if they hadn't. But confession plays a huge part in brainwashing. Hayes says that lying in his cell, lighthearted and lightheaded, as if a tremendous weight had suddenly gone from him, he couldn't be expected to know that there was something peculiar about this. If he had, he might have kept his guard up inside himself. In his mind, comfortably void now, placid, comfortable, a stab came from somewhere within him, a lightning stab of memory, all the more brilliant because he felt so airy. The release of strain let go an unknown energy that hit him like a bolt of lightning. The scene came back to him as if it had happened the same day. How could he have forgotten it? He saw it all now in his mind's eye, all over again, exactly as it had happened. Indeed, how could he have forgotten? Hallucinations can be produced. Under that persistent striving to remember every forgotten detail, the fog had been receding from the scene as far as all matters of fact were concerned. But regarding the transmitting radio, which was part of what he was trying to remember, which had never existed and on which they were continually harping, there was a curious confusion between fact and fancy. The more I think of it, he said to me, the surer I am that the mind is influenced to a great extent by its environment and training, but that the really decisive controlling factor is the spirit. So this isn't a hopeless battle in the fight against brainwashing and mental warfare. You cannot crack the spirit if it is sound, he says. Hayes called this a crusading spirit, sometimes a sense of mission, and this inevitably helped the soldiers to move forward and not break under the pressures. And often this sturdiness of spirit, he said, it was taking captivity captive. If he's got the determination to survive, he'll likely walk out okay. The Reds first mixed up all the races and nationalities, thinking that the men would fight between themselves. It's more the ideologies that divide. Most of all, the Reds tried not to let anyone have anything to think about except communism. In other words, they were inundated with communism, and nothing else could come into their mind or their view, and that was one of their techniques. Confess what? They were always insisting on confessions and on what they called self-criticism. There was a club that had been begun in the camps. It was called the Golden Cross Club. This was a group of black men who, they were several released POWs that had reference to an organization that the blacks had formed while prisoners of the Reds. This sounded almost unbelievable, for the communists had ruthlessly ferreted out and smashed any group that wasn't a part of their network. Yet an organization called the Golden Cross Club against communism was formed right under their noses. He says, I was told it had been started by a fellow named Robert Lee Wyatt. In the lobe of his left ear, I noticed a tiny golden cross. This is what he said. We all pierced our ears at the same time. That way, we felt the pain less. The commies only saw what was stuck in the man's earlobe. They couldn't understand it, but we knew they represented crosses. We formed the club to keep up our spirits. Anyone who wanted would join. Some Filipinos and white Americans did. Another thing that sustained these men were if they had deep convictions, if they had truth in their lives. The Reds could not take away their belief systems. A sense of mission also helped preserve these brave men and women who were in captivity. Having a purpose in their lives and something that would be able to help mankind was a driving sustainer. Almost every POW whom I interviewed brought up in some manner or other the need for maintenance of a spirit, of resistance in camp, hope on which men lived and for the lack of which they died was intimately linked to such a spirit. The Reds fully appreciated this and focused their slyest and most vicious pressures in killing any idea of resistance, and with it, hope. The men had learned through bitter experience to recognize this tactic, screened out dissidents, and subtly managed to induce prisoners to indoctrinate themselves. When a man repeats something often enough, thinking up new ways in which to express it, although he may begin by disbelieving every word of it, he is likely to end up by swallowing a lot of it. Major David F. McGee knew Barnum's axiom, quote, "Never give a sucker an even break," unquote. And he soon realized that the communist version in the POW camps was, quote, "Never give a prisoner a break," unquote. He countered with his own, quote, "Never give the enemy a break," unquote. Dave saw that the moment a man let his guard down, he was knocked for a loop. He learned from his own experiences that a soft word by a Red was just as much a weapon as a slap in the face. When it came to giving a true picture of the mental convolutions and the circuitous thinking that the communists set in motion to break down minds, I came up against the same hurdle with Dave as with the others I had interviewed. You soon lost yourself in circles. When you tried to straighten out the crazy logic to make it intelligible, you no longer presented an accurate account. The upside-down talk and the twisted thinking was what did the trick for the Reds. Making it plain was like trying to show someone the jitterbug by dancing the waltz and saying this was it, only hopped up. The Reds had found that the easiest way to subdue any group of people was to give its members a guilt complex and then to lead them on from self-denunciation to self-betrayal. Every negative, dirty demand was camouflaged in a thick sugar coating of pious and patriotic expression. The statement was packed, of course, with double talk and double think. The essential points were just left out entirely. My knowledge was too limited to reply properly, Dave frankly admitted. When you had no facts to go on, their argument appeared logical. We were supposed to make up our minds without knowing the facts. You couldn't avoid this situation. Their liberal teaching of American educational life. This had taught them only that one must always listen to the other fellow's argument and always be on the side of the underdog. This is like a circle, the indoctrinator said. We use a bad man to teach people good ideas. Once the people learn those good ideas, they will demand that their bad leaders live by their principles. They will rid themselves of their evil leadership and establish a control that will abide by the good ideas. The cleverness of this argument, too, was that it presented a mirage to their own people who were dissatisfied with Red leadership, persuading them to be patient, and they would soon reach this oasis when they would be able to change things for the better. This was a safe outlet for subversive tendencies. Dave got the full indoctrination treatment. He was given 14 hours daily study and classwork. His textbooks ranged from the fictional style writing of Howard Fast to Stalin's superwork, The History of the Communist Party, short course. They gave you a tremendous volume of material that presented only their own side, Dave said. You read it out of sheer boredom. The average intelligent man just had to read something to keep from going crazy. They had plenty of novels for your entertainment, but they all had a red slant. Then they let their serious works trap you by sheer repetition. They forced you to dig your own mental rut and then to deepen it yourself by dragging a hair across the same path 1,000,000 times. I studied those books like the Bible and could often tell them the exact line on a page where something was to be found. Those books gave me my best ammunition, and I had to be exact, for the commies blandly denied anything you couldn't pin down. By throwing chapter and verse back at them, I put them on the spot. The lecturer often had to go to his superiors to have the point cleared up. Frequently, his superiors had to go even higher. They had to go through with the whole rigmarole because they had built up a mysticism that they couldn't let go of without crippling themselves. His quotations always came from the source. They could neither be denied or refuted. The best the Reds could do was to interpret them, which usually took more background than the indoctrinator possessed. That was my ammunition, Dave said. Brainwashing was revealed as a political strategy for expansion and control made up of two processes. One is the conditioning or softening up process, primarily for control purposes. The other is an indoctrination or persuasion process for conversion purposes. Both can be conducted simultaneously, or either of them can precede the other. The communists are coldly practical about it and adjusting their methods to their objective. Only the result counts for them. They want to make sure, so far as they can, that their followers will not grab the first opportunity to turn against them. The long-range objective of brainwashing is to win converts who can be depended on to react as desired at any time, anywhere. And they would make it look like that everything was entirely voluntary. He must be incapable of hearing opposing ideas and facts, no matter how convincing or how forcibly they bombard his senses. A trustworthy communist must react in an automatic manner, without any force being applied. Only then is he the new Soviet man that Lenin foresaw. Communism as practiced in real life, and brainwashing amply proves this, has nothing whatsoever to do with the word as defined by the dictionary. The party's own name is one of its most striking examples of double talk. Communism is a sheer power system, gang rule with modern appliances. So long as the individual submits unquestioningly, he is what is referred to as a disciplined party member. There are things that they use in the brainwashing: hunger, fatigue, tenseness, threats, violence, and even drugs and hypnotism. They're applied in two broad ways. One is called learning, and the other one is called confession. Learning in this sense means only political teaching from the communist standpoint. Confession is an integral part of the rites. In China, there are no exceptions from it for anyone, any more than the attendance at learning classes. Everyone within reach of party cadres, security, police, and soldiers has to attend, even if a hermit in a cave. The retention of his own individuality by a single person is recognized as a deadly menace by the whole monolithic structure. The methods used to make learning and confession palatable and workable are borrowed freely from three sources: evangelism, psychiatry, and science. The language and ideals of each of these fields were taken over and given new meanings and new interpretations in accordance with communist needs. So they redefined words that were common in other societies but had different meanings. The entire mechanism of brainwashing, so as to condition the patient and to indoctrinate him, particularly to accomplish the latter, is geared to putting his mind into a fog. Brainwashing is a system of befogging the brain so a person can be seduced into acceptance of what otherwise would be abhorrent to him. In brainwashing, a fog settles over the patient's mind until he loses touch with reality. Facts and fancy whirl round and change places. Shadow takes form, and form becomes shadow, inducing hallucination. However, in order to prevent people from recognizing the inherent evils in brainwashing, the Reds pretended that it is only another name for something already very familiar and of unquestioned respect, such as education or reform, or at worst a synonym for old-fashioned atrocities. Further, the Reds bring forth the argument that it isn't anything new, but what has been happening all down through history. Brainwashing is something new, which is contrary to human nature and inseparable from communism. Fatigue is another of the chronic conditions under brainwashing. No more insidious poison exists than fatigue. Give him so much politics of a routine nature that he'll have no time for any unorthodox form of it. In other words, busy him to the point that he has nothing else to do but what is desired by the brainwasher. Their captors tried to portray and convince the captives of their omniscience and their omnipotence, that they were all powerful and that they knew everything. And by doing that, they would, look to their captor. What they really do know is exaggerated out of all proportion. They lure him into closing his mind against his own people. And of course they do that by telling them that their people have deserted them. So if there's a young person out there or someone who may be called into war, just remember that if you're told in any type of captivity that no one cares about you anymore, it's absolutely not true. There are people that do care tremendously and are probably actually working behind the scenes for your safety and your freedom. And then of course after they convince the captives that no one is there for them and no one cares and their country's even given up on them, the captors appear to be a safe haven for them and will pleasantly embrace them. And of course this is all tactic and most likely not legitimate nor sincere. Current events are manipulated as part of the brainwashing pattern against which the nations of the free world are just as responsible for keeping their guard up as the lonely lad in a red prison. Nothing is more opposed by the communists than the freedom to be silent. Everyone in a people's discussion must speak up. The subject for repetition might be only a slight detail in red dogma, but like children reciting a new word or phrase until they can never forget it, everyone must repeat this tiny bit of dogma until it becomes etched in their thinking. No wonder the released prisoners from brainwashing chambers anywhere, whether or not they come out influenced by the communist ideology, talk in a peculiar long-winded way for so long. The lingo has been drilled into their heads. The elements that go into brainwashing are intended to make the mind receptive to learning and to browbeat it into confession. Learning and confession are parallel rituals, for as the victim absorbs Marxist teaching, he is obliged to rid himself of the burden and the poisons of his old ideas by confession, cleansing his mind himself, achieving mind reform. That is brainwashing for the masses. The Reds hammered the point that the captured UN soldiers were war criminals, not mere prisoners. Each was a sinner against the Marxist faith. When a man's beaten mind desperately grasps for familiar facts, he is led into confusion and hallucination. That is when the Reds extract their fantastic confessions. They concentrate a man's mind on certain details, some of which may be perfectly true, and once accepted, they rearrange them into the pattern they wish to provide the new false conclusion they are after. This is their technique in all its utter and evil simplicity, like a black mass. I just won't believe it. Pavlov called this type of reaction conditioned inhibition. He was dealing with the reflexes of animals, but the comparison with humans is perfect. By bringing all those unpleasant facts out into the open, the evil that is inherent in communism becomes glaringly apparent. When exposed to the light of day, people instinctively would want to fight it, if only out of a sense of self-preservation. That is why a totalitarian state can only survive by maintaining an iron curtain, what Dr. Freedom calls a conditioned or a controlled environment. The enemy was persuasive and seductive, as well as vindictive and untruthful. So the problem these prisoners faced, reached these conclusions, was how to keep themselves from being seduced in spite of themselves. I also discussed with Dr. Freedom the weird emphasis that the Reds put on confession. They borrowed it from religion for purposes of politics, but used it in a way that put it into the psychiatrist's field. Dr. Freedom said confession was analogous to a psychological catharsis or a mental purge. The Red POW camps were simply large clinical laboratories in which the prisoners were dealt with as patients and as mental cases. Whole populations are also treated in this way, which is why the Reds need their bamboo curtain. Visitors and other contact with the outside would impede or wreck the course of treatment laid down for those captive peoples. The cure is made when people's minds are changed. The objective is to alter their natures by bringing about that robot creature endowed only with instincts, the new Soviet man. That gross parody of medical practice requires fear to make it work. The eternal distrust and suspicion met with in all red society, as Dr. Freedom pointed out so graphically, are fear elements. All autocratic and dictatorial societies are based on fear. They are all controlled societies. These reach their peak in the totalitarian regime. Fear permeates everyone in such a society, from the ruler down to the most abject subject. The Reds arranged their environment in such a way that fear is always present. The psychiatrist recognizes the natural recourse of people to God in time of emergency. The Red indoctrinator strives simply to get into that road and replace God with party. Fear permeates both sides in the communist confession ritual. The man who stands up and confesses does so out of fear, and the inquisitor needs to hear it to quench his own fears. Both are in the same plight. The communist hierarchy depends on these confessions just as much to lay aside its own searing doubts. Their tremendous burden of guilt can only be removed by everyone else taking the blame, absolutely absolving the top. Only by listening to confessions by all these others can they lay aside their own fundamental lack of assurance and remove from their minds for a while the haunting contradictions that plague them. If brainwashing can make a single individual neurotic, what about the inhabitants of a village or a city or even a country when subjected to these same pressures? There is no doubt any longer that this type of mind attack is being waged against entire populations, not only against a few foreigners trapped inside red borders and on nationals regarded as backward elements by the Reds. The only possible conclusion is that a long-range program is being pursued, which, if left unhindered over a long period, will make whole populations just as neurotic as a single individual. Group leaders corresponding to the block captains for neighborhood festivities in the West make sure that everyone participates until each area is molded into the desired form. Individual treatment is reserved mainly for backward elements who lag behind in their conversion. Peasants and workers were lured by double talk and double think into the exact opposite of what they knew in their hearts was good. This is why communist literature is not entrusted to a single individual to write, but is produced by collective authorship in a controlled committee framework. In this way, each sentence can be gone over again and again by able party members to make sure that it contains the exact psychological effect desired by the communist mind manipulators. The same set of psychological techniques are used against the young, the middle-aged, and whatever segments of the aged and communist hierarchy believes are worth salvaging. They are applied with particular intensity to the very young and the teenagers. In this, manipulation of minds is able to continue unhampered. Within a comparatively few years, a new youth will be produced with blind spots in their minds, making them oblivious to anything not acceptable to Pavlovian symbolism. This will create a nation of hysterically inflamed people obsessed with the idea that they have to destroy us before we destroy them. This calculated creation of national neurosis is incontrovertibly the greatest threat ever posed against human society. A people with such a streak in them cannot listen to reason, for they are conditioned into simply not hearing it. Ordinary logic can have no effect on such a body of men. They, like the individual neurotic, require a cure, something fundamentally different than the give and take of a New England town meeting. The only Red defense would be to hush up the subject, because even to deny the idea would be to bring attention to it. Anyone who heard the details, even if he were skeptical, could not help but recognize brainwashing once it was attempted against him. A sensitive nerve has to be left untouched. Anything that rubs against it hurts, Kornfetter added. The damage would be so much the greater if the details about it could get to the people who lived inside the communist countries. Awareness of how it is perpetrated can bring about its ultimate defeat. Knowledge of it is mental vaccination. Never again should our youth worry themselves sick over the double talk of a trained propagandist because they are unable to distinguish between words and motives. In mind war, a man must be prepared for false friends and deprivations of all contact with his own kind. Never again shall a free man suffer the pangs of isolation while in the company of other human beings simply because their skins or their cultures differ radically from their own. Forever hence, he must know the traps that are set up for him by mind attack, traps that are devised with less compassion than those built to capture a wild beast. Free society must teach each man and woman that this is everyone's business, for everyone is the target of total war. There is no front and no rear in mind attack. The people I interviewed were mostly down-to-earth practical men who could not be swept off their feet by emotionalism. The Shanghai lawyer and the Budapest engineer, the top sergeant from Korea, and the automobile salesman from Detroit were men of the world. Still, they declared the most important elements in their survival were faith and prayer. He explained, "The faith that held me up was the philosophy of the crucifixion and rebirth." He tried during his long days and nights of incarceration to recall exactly what the New Testament said about this. He gave himself the task of bringing back to his mind the verses he had learned as a boy in Sunday school. He made a practice in prison of saying grace whenever he ate, no matter what sorry pretense of a meal was put before him. He keenly felt the lack of a Bible and kept asking for one, and they did give him one. A remarkable proportion of the outstanding cases of mental survival was of men with a closed mind on communism. They shut their ears and closed their eyes to what the Reds were saying. They based their attitude on two simple premises. They know that the Reds were telling them lies, and they knew too that when the Reds did tell them something truthful, it was for the purpose of harming them. He used plain common sense when he told himself, "I won't even listen. I don't care what they say. I just don't believe them." The men who closed their minds found that they had hit upon one of the principal defenses against mind attack. A closed mind, of course, is a radical preventative. Fanaticism can easily be confused with it, and this is not what it means. A fanatic not only closes the door in his mind, he cements it shut so it can never be opened again, and shuts every other nearby door the same way, irrespective of where it leads. An intelligent person closes the door when he reaches a conclusion, moving on to other problems, but keeping the key safely in his pocket so he can open it again if he wishes. Every human being has untapped resources of mental and physical powers. Confidence can summon them into action at a moment's notice. With them, a person can accomplish what he never suspected he could do. Confidence can stave off defeatism. We can be confident in the Lord. The responsibility of free society is to let all the people in the world know these facts, at home and abroad, and on both sides of the bamboo iron curtain. The conclusion: only an informed people can shoulder their responsibilities effectively. When free men know both what they are fighting against and what they are fighting to preserve and enhance, they are unbeatable, stronger than any strategy. What is absolutely essential is that the full facts be given to all people. It's my prayer that we'll protect ourselves from falsehoods, that we'll expect to be told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that we won't settle in our hearts and minds on anything but the truth. And we can find that in the Bible, spoken by the Lord Jesus Christ. And I say this in His name, Jesus Christ. Amen.